Not with the flood, not with the rain or the rising water or the desperate scrambling for high ground. Start before all of that, in the silence before the thing that split the world into before and after. Because every flood story, from every culture that has ever told one, begins the same way, with a world that was working, a world that existed, that had people in it, that had structure and meaning and ordinary daily life. And then something happened. Something enormous and ancient and so far outside the normal scale of human experience that the people who survived it could only describe it in the biggest language they had, the language of gods and punishment and the end of one world and the beginning of another.
Let's establish the number first, because the number is the thing that stops people cold when they first encounter it. More than 200 separate flood traditions have been documented by researchers across the world. Not 2, not 20, 200 and more. From Mesopotamia and the Hebrew Bible to the indigenous traditions of North America, South America, Australia, India, China, and Scandinavia. From island cultures in the Pacific who had no contact with Mediterranean civilizations. From landlocked peoples in the mountains of South America who had no reason to fear the sea. 200 stories spread across every inhabited continent, all describing the same basic event.
Now, the skeptical mind, which is a good mind to bring to this question, immediately asks, isn't water a universal human experience? Doesn't every culture live near rivers or coasts or experience seasonal floods? Aren't we just seeing the same natural human impulse to narrativize the most threatening aspects of the natural world? And that is a fair and reasonable question. Yes, water is universal. Yes, humans have always lived near water, depended on it, feared it. But here is what makes the flood story different from a simple local flood myth: the scale. Every single one of these traditions describes not a river overflowing its banks, not a coast.
The oldest written flood story we have is not the Bible. It predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, and it comes from ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, inscribed on clay tablets that are, depending on your specific reaction to the age of things, either staggeringly old or surprisingly recent. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In it, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god that a great flood is coming. He is told to build a vessel. He is told to bring his family and the living creatures of the earth onto it. The rains come, the water rises, everything is destroyed. Eventually, Let's walk through some of the others, because the scope of this tradition is genuinely staggering, and you need to feel it fully to understand what we're dealing with. In Hindu tradition, the god Vishnu warns the sage Manu that a great flood is coming and instructs him to build a boat. Manu survives. He is considered the progenitor of the human race after the flood. In ancient Greek tradition, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned of a coming flood by his father, builds a chest, survives with his wife Pyrrha, and afterward repopulates the earth. In the Aztec tradition, a man and woman survive a flood in a hollow log and later repopulate the island of Hawaiʻi, the highlands of Peru, the forests of West Africa, the frozen plains of Siberia, the mountain villages of ancient China. All of them have it. All of them describe a great water that came and ended the previous world. Some of them describe it with specific details: the duration of the flood, the mountain on which the survivors landed, the birds sent out to search for dry land, that are so similar across traditions that the idea of pure coincidence becomes harder and harder to defend with a straight face. We are not dealing with a local memory of a local event. We are dealing with something that appears to have been. There are three broad categories of explanation that serious researchers, historians, geologists, and mythologists have proposed over the years. The first, the stories are all responses to a real, global or near-global catastrophic flood event that actually happened in prehistory, the memory of which was preserved in oral tradition across cultures until it was eventually written down. The second, the stories reflect the universal human psychological experience of water and destruction and are independently generated symbols that appear similar because humans are similar, not because the event was real. The third, and the most recently developed, the stories reflect specific, real.
Let's talk about the end of the last ice age, because it is one of the most dramatic and underappreciated chapters in the physical history of this planet, and almost nobody talks about it with the urgency it deserves. Approximately 12,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, the Earth was covered in ice sheets of staggering size. The Laurentide ice sheet over North America was in places over a mile thick. Sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. Coastlines that are now underwater were dry land. Entire continental shelves that now sit beneath the ocean were populated, inhabited, lived upon. And then the ice began.
The human species, in its anatomically modern form, has existed for roughly 300,000 years. The oldest written records we have are about 5,000 years old. That leaves 295,000 years of human history, everything that happened before writing, accessible to us only through archaeology, genetics, climate data, and the oral traditions that cultures preserved and eventually wrote down. And here is the uncomfortable thing. The period between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, the exact period when the Ice Age was ending and sea levels were catastrophically rising, is the most underdocumented, most archaeologically invisible period in all of human history. Not because nothing was happening.
Settle into that thought for a moment. A world before the world we know. Not mythology, not religion, not metaphor. The actual physical reality of a planet in the middle of one of the most dramatic climate transitions in recent geological history, with human beings living on it, watching the water rise, year after year after year, the coastline retreating, the low ground filling, the islands that were hills becoming smaller, the stories they told about what was happening reaching their descendants, generation after generation, changing in the telling, the gods filling in where physics was not yet a vocabulary. The clay tablets were buried for 4,000 years before anyone read them again. They were found in the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, excavated in the 1840s and 1850s by a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard, who was digging through the remains of a royal library that had been sealed since 612 BC. The tablets were packed and shipped to the British Museum, where they sat in storage, largely unexamined, for over a decade. And then, in 1872, a self-educated former apprentice banknote engraver named George Smith sat down with one particular fragment and read something that stopped him so completely that, according to the accounts of colleagues who were present, he stood up, began pacing the room, and started taking off his clothes. He had just read, in cuneiform script 4,000 years old, a description of a great flood. The text George Smith was reading is part of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest substantial piece of literature in the human record. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, a city in ancient Mesopotamia, who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, the strongest and most powerful ruler of his age. The epic follows Gilgamesh through friendship, loss, the death of his closest companion, and an increasingly desperate search for immortality. In the course of that search, he travels to the ends of the earth to find the only human being who is.
The flood account within the Epic of Gilgamesh is technically known as the Utnapishtim narrative, and the details are worth going through carefully because the similarities to what most of us know as the Noah story are not vague or general. They are specific and sequential in ways that are difficult to explain as coincidence. Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the other gods have decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. He is told to dismantle his house and build a boat. He is given the specific dimensions. He is told to burn to bore his family, the craftsmen of his city, and the animals of the field. He does. The rains come. They last 7 days and 7 nights. The boat runs aground on a mountain. He sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven.
The academic debate about the relationship between the Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical flood account is long, complicated, and occasionally heated, but its broad outlines are clear. The Epic of Gilgamesh as we have it today was compiled in its fullest surviving form around 1200 BC. The accounts in Genesis are generally dated by biblical scholars to somewhere between the 10th and 6th centuries BC, with complex questions about oral transmission before that. The Mesopotamian version is older. That fact was, when George Smith announced his discovery to the world in 1872, extremely controversial. The London newspapers treated it as a sensation. The public was fascinated and disturbed, and the implications for the relationship between ancient Near Eastern mythology and the Hebrew scriptures were genuinely significant. Today, that debate has matured considerably. Most scholars.
But before we go further into the Gilgamesh account, we need to add one more layer to the Mesopotamian evidence, because the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the only Mesopotamian flood text. There is an older, shorter, and in some ways even more striking document known as the Eridu Genesis, which dates to approximately 1600 BC, and which describes a flood sent by the gods against humanity, and a king named Ziusudra who survives by building a great boat. There is also the Atrahasis epic, again from roughly the same period, which tells the story of the god Enlil's decision to wipe out humanity with a flood because the noise of human civilization was disturbing the god's sleep. You read that correctly.
Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is one of the most flood-prone environments in the world. The rivers are unpredictable, the land is flat, and seasonal flooding was simply a fact of life in the ancient world. Archaeological evidence shows that several ancient Mesopotamian cities experienced significant flood deposits at various points in their histories. In the 1920s, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating the ancient city of found a layer of water-laid silt approximately 8 feet thick, separating 2 distinct layers of human occupation, and immediately declared he had found evidence of the biblical flood. He had not, as subsequent analysis demonstrated. The layer was local and regional, not.
Here is where the story gets genuinely more interesting. Because in 1998, 2 Columbia University marine geologists named William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a book called Noah's Flood, presenting evidence for a specific, dramatic, historically real flood event that they argued was the source of the flood traditions of the ancient Near East. Their hypothesis, approximately 7,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the Mediterranean Sea, swollen by melting glaciers to a level higher than it had ever been, catastrophically breached what is now the Bosphorus Strait. Before this breach, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, lower than the Mediterranean.
The Black Sea hypothesis is not universally accepted. No single hypothesis for the origin of the flood stories is, but the physical evidence for the event itself is solid. Sonar mapping of the Black Sea floor has found ancient river channels and shorelines, now submerged. Researchers have found ancient freshwater mollusk shells on what is now the seabed, at depths that indicate they were once above water. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, led expeditions to the Black Sea in the early 2000s and found evidence of ancient human habitation on the submerged shoreline, including preserved wooden structures. The flood happened. Whether it is the source of the Mesopotamian flood tradition specifically is still debated. But it is a real, dramatic civilization. Let's step back and consider the geography of ancient Mesopotamia one more time, because there's a detail here that is easy to miss. Mesopotamia means, literally, the land between the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, which define this region, both originate in the mountains of what is now Turkey and flow south toward the Persian Gulf. The ancient cities of Uruk, Eridu, the oldest cities in the world, the cities where the flood stories were first written down, were in the southernmost part of this plain, close to the Persian Gulf. They were, in other words, downstream. And the Persian Gulf itself, at the height of the Ice Age, did not exist. The area that is now covered by the shallow Persian Gulf was dry land, inhabited. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends with Utnapishtim living at the mouth of the rivers, in a place described as the source of all things, granted immortality for surviving the flood that destroyed the world. The geography of that description, a man living at the place where the rivers meet the sea, places him in the ancient Near Eastern imagination at exactly the kind of liminal boundary between the old world and the new one, the shore of a transformed landscape, looking out over water that once was land. Whether that is metaphor or racial memory. George Smith, the man who first read the flood tablet, died of dysentery in Aleppo in 1876 at the age of 36, in the middle of a third expedition to find more clay tablets in the ruins of Nineveh. He had taught himself to read cuneiform. He had gone looking for a story that most people in his era believed was unique to the Hebrew Bible, and found it in a language 4,000 years old. His discovery didn't resolve the question of where the flood story came from. It deepened it. It pushed the question further back in time, into the silence before writing, where the only evidence is stone and silt and the stubborn human habit of keeping the... There is one more Mesopotamian detail worth sitting with before we move on. In the Atrahasis epic, after the flood has receded and humanity has survived, and the gods are reconciling themselves to the continued existence of the noisy, difficult, impossible-to-destroy human race, there is a moment where the mother goddess Ninhursag looks at the world that was destroyed and weeps. She holds up her necklace, a jeweled necklace described in the text as something she will look at forever as a reminder, and says, "I will remember these days. I will not forget them." She is making a promise to preserve the memory of what happened. A goddess in a 4,000-year-old clay tablet, making the same promise that every grandmother and storyteller and oral tradition keeper has always made. I will remember. I will pass this down. The story. The tablet itself, the physical object, the fired clay with the wedge-shaped marks pressed into it, is a remarkable thing to think about. It was written approximately 3,200 years ago. Before it was written, the story it contains had already been told for thousands of years. The scribes who inscribed it were preserving something older than their own civilization's writing system, in a language that would become unreadable within a few centuries of their own deaths. And yet here it is, in a museum in London, legible, translated, available to anyone who wants to read it. A message across 4,000 years. A story across perhaps 20,000. The human impulse to preserve knowledge, to keep the record, to make... Let's talk about what the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia would have looked like to the people who first told these stories, not in the age of the written tablets, but further back in the oral tradition period, in the time when the memory of the flood was still raw and recent, and the people telling it were only a few generations removed from the people who had experienced it. The landscape would have been a flat, fertile, river-laced plain, opening at the south into a sea that was still in living memory, advancing. The horizon to the south, where the sea was, would have been a place of anxiety and memory. The rivers, which brought life in the form of irrigation, But death, in the form of flooding, would have been understood as fundamentally. There is a specific detail in the Gilgamesh flood account that has fascinated scholars for generations: the precise dimensions Utnapishtim is given for the boat. The boat he builds is described as a perfect cube, equal in length, width, and height, which is structurally impractical for a real vessel, but which carries enormous symbolic weight in Mesopotamian cosmology, where the cube represented the perfect form of a sealed, self-sufficient world. The boat is not just a boat, it is a world, a complete, contained world, carrying everything necessary for the world to begin again when the water recedes. That symbolic reading, the ark as a miniature world, a seed of the next civilization. The bird sequence in the Gilgamesh account is another of those details that catches people mid-breath when they first read it carefully. After the water begins to recede, Utnapishtim sends out 3 birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven. The dove and swallow return, finding no place to land. The raven does not return because it has found dry land. In the Genesis account, Noah sends out a raven first, then a dove, and the dove eventually returns with an olive branch. The specific birds are slightly different. The sequence is slightly different. But the method, using birds as scouts for the returning earth, is identical. This is not the kind of detail that independently arises in 2 separate traditions. This is the kind of detail that travels. It traveled from somewhere. What do we actually know about the relationship between Mesopotamian and Hebrew culture? Quite a lot, as it turns out. The 2 civilizations were in contact, sometimes peaceful and sometimes catastrophically not, for thousands of years. The Hebrew Bible records the Babylonian exile, the period in the 6th century BC when a significant portion of the Judean population was forcibly relocated to Babylon, the successor civilization to ancient Sumer and Akkad, the civilization that produced Gilgamesh. It is entirely plausible, most scholars consider it likely, that during this period of cultural contact, stories and traditions flowed between the 2 cultures. The flood tradition may have been carried, modified.
There is a word that comes up repeatedly in this conversation among scholars of oral tradition and ancient literature, and it is worth introducing now because we will return to it throughout tonight: mytho-history. It describes the specific category of story that sits on the boundary between myth and history. Stories that encode real historical events in the narrative and symbolic language of mythology, where the gods stand in for natural forces and the heroes stand in for communities, and the supernatural events are the ancient world's way of describing things that actually happened, but that happened before there was a vocabulary of natural science to describe them with. Mytho-history is not a dismissal of these stories as mere myth.
The clay tablets sleep in their museum cases in London. The rivers of Mesopotamia still run to a sea that covers what was once dry ground. The descendants of the people who first told the flood story have spread to every corner of the earth, carrying with them, in varying forms, the oldest memory the human species possesses. Something happened. Something enormous, something water-based, something that ended one world and began another. The people who experienced it did the only thing people can do with an experience that large. They told the story. They told it until it was in the bone and blood of everyone who came after them. They told it until it crossed oceans and mountain ranges and the slow drift of millennia, until it turned up in clay tablets and papyrus scrolls and oral. The lamp is burning low. The tablets are cooling in their cases. The rivers outside the walls of ancient Uruk are doing what rivers have always done, running south toward a sea that is, this night, exactly where it has been for the last several thousand years, covering the ground where someone's ancestor once walked. The flood is over. Has been over for a very long time. But the memory of it is not over. The memory is in the oldest text we have. It is in the story you already know. It is in the 200 and more traditions we have not yet visited, waiting in the oral record of cultures on 6 continents, all saying the same thing in 200 different languages. We are going to visit them. We are going to follow the water around the world, tradition by tradition, culture by culture, until the shape of the original event, whatever it was, begins to emerge from the stories, like land emerging from a receding flood. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight, let the tablets settle into their... We are going to leave Mesopotamia now. We have spent enough time with the clay tablets and the river valleys and the careful, literate civilization that pressed the oldest version of this story into wet clay and fired it into permanence. We are going to go somewhere older, somewhere the story was never written down at all, not because the people who told it were less sophisticated, but because they chose a different technology for preservation, the technology of the human voice, of repetition, of the grandmother who told it to the child, who told it to the grandchild across 10,000 years of unbroken oral chain, until someone finally wrote it down, or until a researcher finally arrived with a notebook and asked, "Let's start in India," because the Indian flood tradition is one of the oldest, most detailed, and most structurally similar to the Mesopotamian accounts of any tradition outside the ancient Near East. In the earliest Sanskrit texts, the Shatapatha Brahmana, which dates in its written form to roughly 700 BC, but contains material scholars believe is considerably older, there is a story about a man named Manu. One morning, Manu is washing his hands when a small fish appears in his wash basin and speaks to him. The fish says, "Keep me, protect me, and I will save you from a great flood that is coming." Manu keeps the fish. It grows. He moves it from... The structural parallels between the Manu story and the Mesopotamian accounts go beyond the basic flood and survivor framework. Both involve a divine warning before the flood. Both involve a specific instruction to build a vessel. Both involve a period of survival on the water while everything else is destroyed. Both involve the vessel coming to rest on a mountain. Both involve the survivor making a religious offering after the water recedes. And both conclude with the survivor being granted a special status. Utnapishtim receives immortality. Manu becomes the progenitor of humanity. These are not vague thematic similarities. These are plot-level structural identities. The question of whether the Indian and Mesopotamian traditions share a common ancestral source is debated by scholars, but the question of whether they are strikingly similar is not. Now we go further east. In ancient China, the flood tradition takes a different form, one that is less about divine punishment and survival in a boat, and more about an enormous landscape-transforming inundation that had to be controlled rather than survived. The story of Gun and Yu, father and son, describes a period when the world was covered in water that would not recede. Gun tries to stop the flood by building dams and fails. His son Yu succeeds, not by building an ark, but by a different method entirely. He digs channels. He redirects the water into the sea. He spends 13 years draining the flooded world, working so hard that he... The Greek tradition gives us Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha. Zeus, disgusted with the corruption and violence of humanity, decides to destroy the world with a flood. Prometheus, the god who gave fire to humans and was punished for it, warns his son Deucalion. Deucalion builds a chest, or in some versions a boat, and he and Pyrrha survive inside it while the rains fall for 9 days and 9 nights and the water covers everything. When the water recedes, the chest comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, or in some versions, Mount Othrys or Athos. Deucalion emerges and makes an offering to Zeus. Then, and this is the detail that makes the Greek version distinctive, an oracle instructs Deucalion and Pyrrha to repopulate. Now we go somewhere the comparison is truly stunning, the indigenous traditions of Mesoamerica. The Maya possessed one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, with an elaborate written tradition, a precise astronomical calendar, and a cosmological framework of extraordinary complexity. Their creation text, the Popol Vuh, preserved in written form from the 16th century, but drawing on oral traditions of immense antiquity, describes multiple creations and destructions of the world. The first humans were made of mud and dissolved. The second were made of wood and were destroyed by a great flood. The wooden people were swept away by a rain that fell from the sky and a flood that rose from the sea simultaneously, while the South America, the Andean traditions, the peoples of the high Andes and the Amazon basin carry their own flood memories, and they are old. The Inca tradition describes a great flood sent by the creator god Viracocha to destroy the people of the previous age. Only those who climbed to the highest mountains survived. Viracocha then created new people from stone at a place called Tiahuanaco. The Tupinamba people of Brazil describe a flood that covered the entire earth and from which only a small number of people survived by climbing trees. The Muisca of Colombia describe a time when their land was covered by a great lake until a figure named Bochica struck the mountains with his staff and let the water drain out. The people who survived the flood became the ancestors of the Muisca. Let's go to Australia. The Aboriginal Australian traditions are among the oldest continuous oral traditions in the world. Some researchers estimate that certain elements of Aboriginal oral history preserve accurate memories of events going back 10,000 years or more, specifically including memories of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The Australian continent was dramatically different during the ice age. Sea levels were low enough that the landmass was substantially larger, and the areas between Australia and the islands to the north were more connected. As sea levels rose, those connections were severed and the coastlines changed dramatically. Aboriginal traditions in coastal areas describe specific geographical features: islands, bays, flooded valleys. The Norse tradition of Ragnarok includes a flood component that is sometimes overlooked in the general apocalyptic drama of the end of the gods. When the great world serpent Jormungandr releases its tail and the seas rise, and when the wolf Fenrir breaks free and the world is covered in water, some survive. Lif and Lifthrasir, a man and a woman, hide in the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and survive the world's destruction to emerge and repopulate the earth. Even in the cold north, in the Norse tradition of world endings and new beginnings, there are two people, a catastrophic inundation, and a world beginning again. The names are different, the gods are different, the structure is. Here is what you notice when you lay all of these traditions side by side. The specific details vary enormously. The vessel is a cube-shaped boat in Mesopotamia, a chest in Greece, a log in some Native American traditions, a tree in others. The divine cause varies: a god's anger, a god's mercy, a cosmic cycle, a creator's decision to start over. The survivors vary in number and identity, but the core sequence, warning, preparation, catastrophe, survival, new world, is so consistent across traditions with no documented contact that it forces a question. Either the human mind, independently in every culture, generates this specific narrative sequence when it tries to process the idea of catastrophic destruction, or the sequence is preserved because the sequence is. The specific detail of the mountain is worth its own moment because it appears with remarkable consistency. The boat, or the survivors, come to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim lands on Mount Nisr. Noah lands on Ararat. Deucalion lands on Parnassus. Manu's boat is guided to a northern mountain. The Andean survivors climb to the highest peaks. Mountains appear in flood traditions on every continent, and there is a simple physical reason for this that has nothing to do with mythology. If you were trying to survive a catastrophic flood, a mountain is where you would go. The mountain is high ground. The mountain is the last thing above water. The mountain is survival. The consistency of the mountain across 200 traditions may be the... Let's talk about the Hawaiian tradition, because it is geographically isolated in a way that makes its flood story particularly striking. Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from any continent. The indigenous Hawaiian people arrived by ocean-going canoe from Polynesia, and their oral traditions are among the most carefully preserved in the Pacific. The Hawaiian flood tradition involves a figure named Nu. Notice the phonetic similarity to the Sumerian Ziusudra and the Hebrew Noah, which scholars debate as either significant or coincidental, who builds a great canoe with a house on top and survives a flood that covers the earth, coming to rest on the top of Mauna Kea. He makes an offering, mistakenly directed at the moon, until the god Kane descends on a rainbow and corrects him. The Ojibwe people of North America tell of Wainabuju, a cultural hero who survives a great flood by floating on a log with a group of animals. He asks the animals to dive to the bottom of the flood and bring up mud from which he can recreate the earth. Several animals try and fail. Finally, a muskrat dives down, almost dies in the attempt, but surfaces with a tiny bit of mud in its paw. Wainabuju takes the mud and places it on a turtle's back, and from that small piece of earth, the whole world is remade. This is the Turtle Island creation story, the world on the back of a turtle that is central to many indigenous North American traditions. It begins with a flood. The world is recreated from a tiny fragment of what existed before. What do all of these stories have in common beyond the water? They have a reckoning. Every flood tradition includes, somewhere in its structure, a moment of account, a reason why the flood came. In the Mesopotamian accounts, humanity was too noisy or too corrupt. In the biblical account, humanity had become wicked. In the Greek account, humanity had become violent and impious. In the Mayan account, the wooden people had mistreated the animals and forgotten to honor the gods. Even in traditions where the flood is presented more as a cosmic cycle than a divine punishment, there is an implicit logic of before and after. The previous world had failed in some way, and the flood was the mechanism by which the failure was cleared. There is a thread running through all of these stories that is easy to miss if you're focused on the dramatic elements, the water, the boat, the mountain. The thread is this: someone was chosen. In almost every tradition, the flood survivor was not random. They were warned. They were selected. They were given specific information and specific instructions that allowed them to survive when everyone else did not. Utnapishtim was chosen by Ea. Noah was chosen by Yahweh. Manu was chosen by Vishnu. Deucalion was warned by Prometheus. The survivor is always, in some sense, the right person, the person the gods or the universe or the narrative logic of the tradition needed to survive in order for the world to continue. This is partly a narrative convenience. The story. What would it actually feel like, physically and emotionally, to survive something like the events these stories are describing? We are talking about a water event on a scale that ended one world and began another. You have lost everyone you knew except the people on your vessel or your mountaintop. The landscape you grew up in, the rivers, the fields, the landmarks, the paths you walked every day of your childhood, is gone, underwater, permanently altered. The people who knew the names of those places, who remembered what was there, are mostly dead. You are left with the task of building something new in a world you no longer fully recognize, carrying inside you the memory of a world that no longer exists. That memory would be precious. That memory would be sacred. That memory would be the thing you passed to your children before anything else, the thing you insisted they... Researchers studying the oral traditions of indigenous cultures around the world have found, repeatedly, that the most carefully preserved stories, the ones transmitted with the greatest fidelity across the most generations, are the ones that contain practical survival information. Stories about which plants are poisonous, stories about which weather patterns precede dangerous events, stories about which coastlines are safe and which are treacherous. The flood story, in this framework, is the ultimate survival story. This is what a world-ending flood looks like, and this is what you must do to survive it. Get to high ground, build something that floats, bring food and animals, wait for the water to recede, send out birds. These are not spiritual instructions. These are physical ones, dressed in the...
There are cultures whose flood stories have only recently been collected and studied, traditions that were nearly lost because the people who carried them experienced colonization, cultural suppression, or the interruption of the oral chain by which the stories were transmitted. The recovery of some of these traditions has been one of the quiet, ongoing projects of anthropologists and indigenous scholars over the last century. The painstaking work of finding the last elder who knows the full version, recording it, translating it, making it available before it disappears. Some have been recovered just in time. Some have not been recovered at all. What we have, the 200 traditions that researchers have documented, may represent a fraction of what once existed. Every tradition we have lost is a data point gone. Every story that was silenced or suppressed was a thread in the same enormous fabric, gone dark. The flood story survived 200 times. We are left at the end of this global survey with a question that sits at the center of everything tonight is about. Not whether there is a shared flood tradition across human cultures. That is established beyond serious debate by the weight of documented evidence. But whether the tradition points to a shared event. Whether 200 stories told on 6 continents in cultures with no documented contact, all pointing to the same core sequence of catastrophic global inundation and miraculous survival, are remembering the same thing, the same water, the same world that was lost, the same determination to carry the memory forward into whatever came next. We don't know yet. Tonight we are still building the case, but the shape of the answer is beginning to emerge, the way land emerges from a receding flood, slowly, unevenly, one solid piece at a time. The traditions are quiet now. The stories have been told for tonight. The fish that warned Manu, the chest that carried Deucalion, the muskrat with mud in its exhausted paw, the woman and man who waited in the branches of the world tree while the sea rose around them. All of them telling the same thing in different words. All of them preserving the same memory in different containers. The water was real. The loss was real. The survival was real. And the telling of the story, the insistence, across 200 traditions and 10,000 years on keeping the memory alive, that is real too. That is perhaps the most real thing of all. The human refusal to let the drowned world be forgotten. The lamp is burning low. The stories are settling into the silence where they live between tellings. Let your breath go slow. Let the water go still. Somewhere, right now, a grandmother is telling her grandchild the oldest story in the world.
We have been moving through stories, through clay tablets and oral traditions, and the careful preservation of memory across 10,000 years of human telling. But tonight, we need to step back from the stories entirely, step back from the gods and the boats and the mountains, and look at the physical world. Because the physical world has its own record of what happened. It is written not in clay or papyrus or the spoken word, but in ice cores and ocean sediment and submerged coastlines and the slow, indifferent testimony of geology. And what the physical world has recorded is, in its own way, just as staggering as anything the stories say. The earth itself remembers the flood. And in the last several decades, the tools to read that memory have become precise. We need to go back approximately 20,000 years, the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when the Earth was locked in cold so profound that ice sheets covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched across virtually all of Canada and deep into what is now the northern United States, in places reaching a thickness of more than 2 miles. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered all of Scandinavia and much of northern Europe. Similar sheets covered portions of South America, New Zealand, and the mountain ranges of Central Asia. The total volume of water locked in these ice sheets was staggering, enough when it eventually melted to raise global sea levels by approximately 400 feet. 400 vertical feet of ocean that did not yet exist, waiting in ice.
The melting was not smooth or gradual. This is the part that the simple textbook version of the Ice Age ended tends to miss. The deglaciation of the Earth was punctuated, interrupted by dramatic, sudden events the geologists call meltwater pulses. These were episodes of catastrophically rapid sea level rise, triggered by the sudden collapse of ice sheets or the catastrophic drainage of ice-dammed glacial lakes, during which global sea levels could rise by several feet within a human lifetime, or in some cases within a human generation. The most dramatic of these, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, let's make this concrete, because the numbers are large and can be abstract. Imagine you are living on a coastal plain at the edge of the ocean approximately 14,000 years ago. The climate is warming. Slowly, over your lifetime, you have noticed that winters are milder than your grandparents described them, that the glaciers on the distant mountains are retreating. The sea, as far back as anyone can remember, has been stable. Your village is perhaps a kilometer from the shore. Your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren will tell stories about how the sea has moved. In your lifetime, the shore has crept perhaps 100 meters closer. Not alarming, not catastrophic. Then, in a period of decades, perhaps less, the rate increases. The shore that was a kilometer away is now 500 meters away, then 300. Then the storms that used to stop short of the village are reaching it. Then
The continental shelves of the world are, in geological terms, very recently drowned land. The shallow seas around the edges of continents, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, the waters around Australia, are all areas that were dry, inhabitable land during the Ice Age. The combined area of land that was submerged by rising sea levels between 20,000 and 6,000 years ago is estimated at approximately 27 million square kilometers. To put that in context, that is larger than the combined area of North America and Europe. An entire continent's worth of coastline and coastal plain, with whatever human habitation existed on it, is now underwater. We have never excavated it. We have barely mapped it.
Human beings have always lived near water. This is not a romantic observation. It is a practical one, grounded in the basic requirements of survival. Fresh water, food from rivers and coasts, easier transportation, milder climates, all of these factors drew human populations to coasts and riverbanks. Archaeological and anthropological evidence consistently shows that coastal populations in the modern world are denser than inland ones, and there is no reason to think this was different in prehistory. Which means that the populations living on those 27 million submerged square kilometers were not sparse or marginal. They may have been among the densest and most sophisticated human populations of their age. And everything they built, every structure, every tool, every cultural artifact, is sitting on the ocean floor, slowly being buried under sediment, completely inaccessible to the archaeological record that has shaped our entire understanding of where humans.
There is a hypothesis, controversial, compelling, and in the last 2 decades increasingly supported by physical evidence, that the period between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago, which we tend to think of as a dark age of scattered hunter-gatherers slowly developing the technologies that would eventually produce civilization, may in fact have been a period of considerably more sophisticated human activity along the now submerged coastlines of the world. Not civilization in the sense of cities and writing, those came later, but organized, complex, coastal-adapted communities trading along coastlines, developing maritime technology, potentially spreading across ocean routes that are now underwater, leaving almost no trace above water because the traces they left are below.
What we do have is genetics. The genetic record of human migration and dispersal is written in our DNA, and modern genomic analysis has produced a map of human movement that is considerably more complex, more ancient, and more geographically extensive than the archaeological record alone would suggest. Genetic studies have found evidence of ancient population movements across the Pacific that predate what most archaeologists considered possible given the available boat technology. They have found evidence of contact between South American populations and Polynesian populations thousands of years before European contact. They have found evidence of genetic lineages in the indigenous populations of the Americas.
The Black Sea event that William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed in 1998 is worth returning to in more physical detail because it is the single best documented example of a catastrophic, rapid, regionally civilization-ending flood event in the post-Ice Age world. Before approximately 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, fed by rivers with a shoreline sitting roughly 150 meters below the current sea level. The shores of this lake were inhabited. Farmers, herders, and fishing communities had lived around its edges for thousands of years, in a relatively stable environment with predictable seasons and a consistent shoreline. Then, the Mediterranean, swollen by thousands of years of glacial meltwater, breached the rock barrier at the Robert Ballard's expeditions to the Black Sea in 2000 and subsequent years found something remarkable. Because the deep waters of the Black Sea are anoxic, lacking in oxygen, organic materials that would normally decompose are preserved. His team found ancient wooden structures preserved in the anaerobic depths at sites consistent with the pre-flood shoreline. They found ancient river channels and beaches still visible on sonar. They found the shells of freshwater mollusks that had lived in the lake before the saltwater came, still sitting on the seabed where they died, their radiocarbon dates consistent with the proposed timing of the flood event. The flood that Ryan and Pittman proposed is not a hypothesis anymore in terms of the event itself.
Now let's zoom out from the Black Sea and consider the global picture that emerges when you map the flood traditions of the world against the geography of Ice Age sea level change. The regions with the densest concentration of ancient flood traditions, Mesopotamia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, coastal North America, are almost all regions where the post-Ice Age sea level rise would have had its most dramatic and visible effects. Mesopotamia sits above what was once the dry floor of the Persian Gulf. The Indian subcontinent's coastal areas would have seen dramatic inundation as sea levels rose. Southeast Asia's Sunday Shelf, the vast shallow sea between the major islands, was dry land during the Ice Age. The Dogger Bank in the North Sea between Britain and Denmark is a shallow underwater plateau that was dry land during the Ice Age, a vast low-lying plain that archaeologists have named Doggerland, home to Ice Age hunter-gatherer communities whose tools and artifacts are occasionally dredged up by fishing trawlers. Doggerland was inundated progressively as sea levels rose, and the process was apparently punctuated by a dramatic event around 6200 BC, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, which triggered a tsunami that swept across the low-lying areas of Doggerland, inundating what remained of the habitable land and pushing the survivors inland into what are now the British Isles.
There is a scientist named Randall Carlson who has spent decades mapping what he calls the catastrophic geology of the post-Ice Age period, specifically focusing on the evidence for sudden, dramatic flood events caused by the draining of enormous glacial lakes in North America. The largest of these, Glacial Lake Agassiz, at its maximum extent covered more area than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, held by ice stamps in what is now Canada. When those ice dams failed, and they failed more than once in sudden catastrophic drainage events, they released volumes of fresh water into the oceans so large that global sea levels jumped measurably within years. These drainage events are associated with sudden climate disruptions recorded in ice cores, with dramatic changes in ocean circulation, and with the dates of several of the world's most dramatic flood traditions. The draining of glacial
Ice cores. Let's talk about ice cores, because they are one of the most extraordinary scientific tools available for reconstructing the climate of the past, and because what they have revealed about the post-Ice Age period is genuinely remarkable. When snow falls on Greenland or Antarctica and is compressed into ice, it traps tiny bubbles of the atmosphere at the time of its formation. By drilling into the ice and extracting cores, scientists can read the atmospheric record going back hundreds of thousands of years, measuring ancient temperatures, ancient greenhouse gas concentrations, ancient volcanic eruptions, and the dramatic climate transitions of the past. The ice core record of the post-Ice Age period shows repeated sudden climate disruptions, rapid warmings, sudden coolings, massive volcanic events.
There is a concept in climate science called abrupt climate change. The idea that the climate system, rather than changing gradually and smoothly, can reach tipping points and shift suddenly and dramatically within decades or even years. The end of the Ice Age was not a smooth transition. It was a series of abrupt shifts, some of them extraordinarily rapid by geological standards. The Younger Dryas event, which occurred approximately 12,900 years ago, saw the Earth plunge back into near-glacial conditions within decades after a period of rapid warming, triggered, most researchers believe, by a massive injection of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic from melting ice sheets. The end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,700 years ago, saw an equally abrupt return to warm conditions. What does this mean for the flood stories? It means that the period between approximately 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, during which the bulk of post-Ice Age sea level rise occurred, was also a period of repeated, sudden, catastrophic climate events, any one of which could have been experienced by human communities as an apocalyptic disruption. Multiple regional floods, triggered by multiple mechanisms, glacial lake drainages, ice sheet collapses, tsunamis, coastal inundations, were occurring in different parts of the world during the same multi-thousand-year period. Different cultures in different locations, experiencing different specific events, may each have generated their own flood tradition in response to their own specific catastrophe. And because all of these catastrophes occurred during the same extended period of the Holocene Impact Working Group is a body of scientists who have been collecting and analyzing evidence for a different kind of catastrophic event that they believe may have contributed to the post-Ice Age disruptions, cosmic impacts. Specifically, the hypothesis that fragments of a large comet or asteroid struck the Earth approximately 12,900 years ago at the beginning of the Younger Dryas event, triggering the abrupt climate change, contributing to the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, and potentially destroying human communities across the Northern Hemisphere. The evidence for this hypothesis is debated, but physical markers consistent with an extraterrestrial impact, nanodiamonds, spherules, iridium anomalies, have been found at multiple sites around the world at the relevant geological boundary. If a cosmic impact contributed to the catastrophes of this period, it adds another. Let's bring it back to the human scale. Because the ice cores and the sea level charts and the geological hypotheses can make it easy to lose sight of what all of this was at its most fundamental level, a catastrophe experienced by human beings, people who had families, languages, memories, stories, people who watched their world end and survived, or who heard from those who did, or who were born into a world that had just been transformed by water and learned from their earliest childhood that the world before was different and the world before was gone. The Ice Age transition killed the world that those people knew, the coastlines they had lived on, the islands that had been highlands, the shallow seas that had been plains, the rivers that drained through landscapes now underwater, All of it was transformed in a period that from the inside.
We are standing in 2026 at a genuinely interesting moment in this particular question. The technology to survey the seafloor has advanced dramatically in the last 2 decades. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and increasingly affordable deep-water exploration have made it possible to survey large areas of the continental shelves that have never been examined. Researchers in India have found what appear to be submerged structures in the Gulf of Khambhat that some argue represent pre-flood civilization. Researchers in the Mediterranean have found submerged Bronze Age settlements at depths that suggest the Mediterranean was lower than currently understood at the relevant period. The systematic survey of the world's continental shelves for evidence of pre-flood human habitation.
The ice is quiet now. The glaciers that once covered half the world have retreated to their poles and their mountain peaks, leaving behind the shaped landscape of their passing, the carved valleys, the deposited moraines, the submerged coastlines. The sea sits at its current level, 400 feet higher than it was at the last glacial maximum, covering the world that was. The traditions that remember the transition are still being told in various forms, in various languages, on every inhabited continent. And in laboratories and universities, and on research vessels slowly crossing the continental shelves with their sonar equipment, scientists are beginning to read the physical record of what the stories have been saying all along. The water came. It came from the melting ice and the breaking dams and the collapsing coastlines and the sea that would not stop rising. It came for thousands of years, and the people who survived it told their children and their children's children for 10,000 years, remember the water, remember what was lost, and whatever you do, remember. Let that be the last thing tonight, the remembering, the determination to keep the record. Let your breath go slow. The ice is gone. The water is still. And
every story about a flood is also a story about what existed before the flood. The water is the dramatic event, the thing that splits time into before and after. But the before is where the story's real weight lives, the world that was lost, the civilization that was drowned, the knowledge and the culture and the people who went under and did not come back up. Tonight, we are going to spend time in the before, not in the mythology of a golden age or a perfect paradise, but in the actual, physical, reconstructible reality of what human life looked like on the coastlines and coastal plains of the world before the sea rose and covered them. Because the science now allows us to do that with a degree of precision that was not possible even a generation ago. We can, with reasonable confidence, describe the coastlines of the world during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were at their lowest, were radically different from what they are today. The Persian Gulf did not exist. In its place was a river valley, fed by the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and other rivers, running through a fertile, well-watered plain before eventually emptying into the Indian Ocean far to the south of the current Gulf mouth. This valley, which some researchers have called the Gulf Oasis, was a sheltered, resource-rich environment in what was otherwise a relatively arid region. It had fresh water, fish, game, and the kind of protected geography that tends to attract and sustain human settlement. And it sat in the heart of the region that Jeffrey Rose, an archaeologist at the University of Birmingham, has spent years developing and refining what he calls the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the proposal that the now submerged floor of the Persian Gulf was a center of human population and cultural development during the Ice Age,
and that the flooding of the Gulf as sea levels rose drove a significant human migration into the river valleys of Mesopotamia, bringing with them cultural traditions, technological knowledge, and the memory of the world they had lost. The hypothesis explains several things that have puzzled archaeologists about the early history of Mesopotamian civilization. The apparently sudden appearance of sophisticated
the Sunda Shelf. If the Persian Gulf is the drowned world of the Mesopotamian traditions, then the Sunda Shelf is the drowned world of Southeast Asia, and it is, if anything, even more dramatic. During the last glacial maximum, the shallow seas between the modern islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula were dry land. The entire region was a single large landmass, sometimes called Sundaland by researchers, roughly the size of Western Europe, with rivers, mountains, forests, and coastlines. As sea levels rose, this landmass was progressively inundated, with the flooding accelerating dramatically during the meltwater pulses of the post-Ice Age period. The final submergence of the Sunda Shelf occurred roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. The people who lived there, and genetic and archaeological evidence suggests they were numerous and culturally sophisticated. The flood traditions of Southeast Asia, Polynesia, and the Pacific Islands are among the most geographically specific of any in the world. Many of them describe in detail the specific landscapes that were lost, islands that sank, coastlines that retreated, mountains that became the only remaining land above the water. In some cases, researchers comparing these traditional geographical descriptions with the reconstructed bathymetry of the Sunda Shelf have found correspondences that are difficult to explain as coincidence. The traditions are describing real places, places that are now underwater. The oral record preserved the geography of a drowned world with sufficient accuracy that Australia and the surrounding region provides perhaps the most rigorously tested case for oral tradition preserving accurate memory of post-Ice Age sea level rise. A team of researchers led by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed published a landmark study in 2015 analyzing Aboriginal Australian traditions from communities around the continent's coastline and comparing the geographical events described in those traditions with the known history of sea level change in those specific locations. They found that multiple traditions appeared to preserve accurate memories of specific coastal inundations, bays that were formed, islands that were created, landmarks that were drowned, with dates consistent with the post-Ice Age sea level rise timeline. One tradition, from the area around what is now Spencer Gulf in South Australia, appears to describe the flooding of a valley that occurred approximately.
What does this tell us about the human capacity for oral transmission? It tells us something genuinely remarkable. The Western academic tradition has tended to treat oral history with considerable skepticism, viewing it as inherently unstable, subject to distortion, unreliable beyond a few generations. The evidence from Aboriginal Australia and from other oral traditions that have been rigorously compared with physical evidence suggests that this skepticism, while appropriate in many contexts, systematically underestimates what carefully maintained oral tradition can do. When a community understands its oral tradition as sacred, when the transmission of the stories is a religious and cultural obligation, when specialists are trained from childhood in accurate preservation, when the community as a whole maintains the lost continent of Kumari Kondam in Tamil tradition, the sunken land of Lioness in Celtic tradition, the drowned city of Is in Breton legend, the lost island of Atlantis in the Greek tradition. The world's mythologies are full of descriptions of lands that were swallowed by the sea. For a long time, scholars treated all of these as pure mythology, symbolic stories about transience and loss, with no geographical reality behind them. The emerging picture from geology, oceanography, and the careful analysis of oral traditions suggests a different reading. These are not purely symbolic. They are imperfectly preserved, mythologically elaborated, but fundamentally real memories of real geography. Atlantis deserves its own moment, not because it has been proven, it has not,
but because the way Plato describes it in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias is interesting in the context of everything we have been discussing tonight. Plato's account, written in approximately 360 BC, claims to be based on information transmitted from Egypt through the Athenian statesman Solon, who reportedly heard it from Egyptian priests, who claimed it was drawn from records far older than anything in the Greek tradition. The story describes a large island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that was destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods, and sank beneath the sea. There is a category of ancient text that researchers in this field return to repeatedly, the antediluvian king lists. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the Sumerian king list, a document that purports to record the names and reign lengths of all the kings of Sumer, begins with a peculiar section, a list of 8 kings who ruled before the flood, each for tens of thousands of years. These reign lengths are obviously not literal, but the structure of the list, before the flood, kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, after the flood, kings whose reign lengths dropped to historically plausible numbers, preserves an interesting memory. There was a time before the flood. The people of that time were different, greater, longer-lived. And what was actually different about the world before the water? We can answer this question, at least partially, with the physical evidence available to us. Before the post-Ice Age sea level rise, the world's continental shelves, now submerged, were home to a significant portion of the world's human population. These coastal populations had access to an extraordinary range of food resources: fish, shellfish, marine mammals, coastal plants, estuarine ecosystems of enormous productivity. The shallow coastal seas and river deltas of the Ice Age world were among the most resource-rich environments on Earth. The people who lived in them were not primitive wanderers. They were, by the evidence of their descent, the survivors of the various flood events would have arrived in the inland areas that became the cradles of recorded civilization: Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, Egypt, carrying with them not just the memory of loss, but the practical knowledge of their drowned cultures. The sudden appearance of sophisticated agricultural communities in these regions at roughly the period consistent with post-Ice Age coastal displacement has always been somewhat difficult to explain purely in terms of local development. The knowledge appears in the archaeological record somewhat faster than independent invention would predict. The hypothesis that some of this knowledge was carried inland by refugees from the drowned coastlines, people who had already developed agricultural techniques, astronomical knowledge, organizational systems, would explain the apparent acceleration. The flood refugees. The figure of the culture hero appears in traditions around the world, the individual or small group who arrives from elsewhere, often following a catastrophe, and teaches the local population the arts of civilization. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu, the 7 antediluvian sages, half man and half fish, are described as having emerged from the sea to teach humanity writing, agriculture, law, and the other foundations of civilization. In the Andean tradition, Viracocha emerges from Lake Titicaca and teaches the people civilization before disappearing into the sea. In the Mesoamerican tradition, let's talk about what was lost that we cannot recover. The libraries of the drowned world, if there were any, are gone. The tools and artifacts of coastal Ice Age civilization are buried under sediment on the continental shelves, subject to the corrosion and decomposition of thousands of years of salt water. The languages that were spoken are gone, not a single word preserved, except possibly as a structural substrate in the languages that descended from them. The art, the music, the social structures, the religious practices, all of it went under with the coastlines. What survived is what could be carried: seeds, animals. There is a haunting passage in the Atrahasis epic, the Mesopotamian flood text, where the god Ea, who has warned Utnapishtim of the coming flood, instructs him in how to explain to his neighbors why he is building the boat. He is told to say, "Enlil does not love me. I must leave his land and go to the sea." He is told to conceal the real reason. And so while Utnapishtim builds his salvation, his neighbors help him without knowing what they are helping build. They will all die in the flood they are helping to prepare against. This detail is usually read as a theological point about the gods' ambivalence toward humanity. But it is also a startlingly realistic detail about the social dynamics of disaster preparation. The person who knows what is coming and cannot convince others to believe them, surrounded by people who will soon need the information they are withholding. It is the detail of someone who survived by knowing something that most people didn't. And it raises a question.
High ground knowledge. The people who survived catastrophic coastal flooding in the post-Ice Age world were, by definition, the people who knew where the high ground was, who had access to it, and who moved to it in time. In a world without written maps, this knowledge would have been embedded in oral tradition, in the stories that told you which mountains were safe, which routes led inland, which valleys flooded and which didn't. The communities that maintained and transmitted this knowledge survived. The communities that didn't. And the knowledge was maintained in exactly the form that knowledge was maintained in the pre-literate world, as story. The flood story in this reading is a survival manual. The specific details, build a vessel, bring animals, go to the mountain, send out birds, are the instructions for surviving the thing that destroyed the previous. What would a serious, well-funded archaeological survey of the world's continental shelves find? We don't know, because it hasn't been done. The systematic underwater archaeology of the post-Ice Age drowned world is one of the most significant scientific undertakings that has not yet been seriously attempted. Individual researchers have done extraordinary work in specific locations, the Black Sea expeditions, the Gulf of Combat surveys, the work in the North Sea on Doggerland, the surveys of the Sunda Shelf. But a comprehensive, globally coordinated effort to map and excavate the drowned coastlines of the Ice Age world does not exist. The Tamil tradition of South India preserves a memory of a lost land called Kumari Kondam, a large landmass to the south of the Indian subcontinent that was, according to the tradition, the original home of Tamil civilization, swallowed by the sea in a series of catastrophic inundations. Tamil scholars have traced references to Kumari Kondam in texts going back over 2,000 years, with the tradition itself claimed to be much older. Modern bathymetric surveys of the waters to the south of the Indian subcontinent show that the Sunda Shelf and the shallow areas of the Indian Ocean were indeed substantially larger during the Ice Age, and that progressive inundation following the end of the Ice Age would have submerged large areas of coastline and low-lying land. The tradition of Kumari Kondam is not literal. We are beginning to be able to read the shape of the world before the water. Not perfectly, not completely, but with increasing resolution. The bathymetric maps of the continental shelves show the old coastlines and river valleys. The genetic record shows the population movements that followed the inundations. The oral traditions show the cultural memory of the loss. And the physical evidence, the submerged structures, the freshwater mollusk shells on the seabed, the preserved wooden timbers in the anaerobic depths of the Black Sea, shows the material reality of what was there. The world before the water was real. It was inhabited. It was, in some cases, sophisticated. And it is mostly gone. What is not gone is the story. The story survived in The water is still tonight. The continental shelves lie in their darkness, covered by seas that have been where they are for 6,000 years, since the post-Ice Age rise finally slowed, and the coastlines more or less stabilized into the shapes we now call normal. Under the water, in the sediment and the silt, the old world is waiting.
Patient, only the truly ancient can be patient. The way a drowned city is patient. The way a submerged river valley is patient. The way a story that has been told for 10,000 years is patient. Not lost, just underwater. Not forgotten, just waiting to be found. The lamp is burning low. The stories are still. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the deep water, the slow drift of the sediment settling over the old world, the steady, quiet patience of what is waiting. The drowned world is there. We are only beginning to look. And the looking, that too is a kind of remembering.
Every flood story ends the same way. The water recedes, the vessel settles on the mountain, the door opens, and someone steps out into a world that is simultaneously the same planet they have always lived on and a completely different world from the one they knew. The sky is the same sky, the sun is the same sun, but everything below the horizon, every familiar landmark, every path, every field, every house, every face they had known since childhood is gone, altered or drowned, or simply absent in the particular way that things are absent when they are never coming back. The survivor stands at the threshold of the new world with everything they managed to carry, and the question that every refugee in every age has faced: what do you do now? Tonight we are going to follow the survivors, not the mythological versions, not Utnapishtim. Imagine the logistics of survival in the post-Ice Age world. You are not surviving a single dramatic flood event after which the water stops and the world is stable. You are surviving a process, decades or centuries of progressive inundation punctuated by dramatic sudden events, during which the livable land is steadily shrinking and the direction of movement is always the same: inland, uphill, away from the advancing sea. You have time sometimes to prepare. You can watch the waterline creep closer over the course of years and make decisions: what to take, what to leave, which direction to move, where to settle next. And then the sudden events come: the meltwater pulses, the glacial lake drainages, the tsunamis, the rapid inundations, and the time for deliberate preparation is gone. And what would you carry if you had to leave your home? Leave the coastline you had lived on for generations. Leave the fishing grounds and the river mouths and the sheltered bays, and move inland with whatever you could take. What would you take? The practical answer is seeds and animals. Seeds because the ability to grow food is the most fundamental survival technology there is. And carrying seeds means carrying the food system of your culture to wherever you are going. Animals because domestic animals, the goats, the dogs, the cattle, the pigs that had been bred and managed over generations, represent an enormous investment of time and knowledge and genetic selection that cannot be easily recreated from wild stock. The flood stories almost... After seeds and animals, you carry knowledge. Specifically, the kind of knowledge that cannot be quickly reinvented. The accumulated expertise of generations of observation, experimentation, and refinement that allows a community to survive in a specific environment. Agricultural knowledge: which crops grow in which soils, how to manage irrigation, when to plant. Astronomical knowledge: the calendar systems that tell you when to plant and when to harvest, how to navigate by the stars, how to predict the seasons. Medical knowledge: which plants heal and which poison, how to treat injuries and infections with the materials available in the natural world. Architectural knowledge: how to build structures that survive the specific weather conditions of your region. There is a specific type of knowledge that appears in various forms in cultures around the world that researchers in this field find particularly interesting: astronomical knowledge embedded in mythology. The precise positions of stars, the movements of planets, the timing of solstices and equinoxes. This information, which requires sustained, accurate, multi-generational observation to accumulate, appears in the mythological traditions of cultures that have no other apparent reason to possess it. The ancient Mesopotamians had sophisticated astronomical knowledge that predates their earliest written records, suggesting it was accumulated over a much longer period than the written tradition covers. The indigenous traditions of Australia contain.
The megalithic tradition deserves its own moment. Between approximately 10,000 and 4,000 years ago, people across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia built enormous stone structures, standing stones, stone circles, burial mounds, dolmens, many of them precisely aligned with astronomical events. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it is far from the most ancient. Göbekli Tepe in what is now southern Turkey, which dates to approximately 11,600 years ago, right at the transition out of the Younger Dryas and into the post-Ice Age warming, is a massive, sophisticated ritual complex built by people who are supposed, according to the conventional archaeological narrative, to have been hunter-gatherers with no surplus economy and no. The agricultural revolution, the transition from hunter-gatherer subsistence to settled farming, is one of the most significant transitions in human history, and its timing and geography have always been somewhat puzzling. It appears to have begun in multiple locations around the world at roughly the same period: the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yellow River Basin of China, the highlands of New Guinea, the Andes of South America, central Mexico. The conventional explanation is that these were independent inventions, each driven by local conditions. But the clustering of the timing, most of these agricultural origins fall within the window of approximately 12,000 to 8.
Let's talk about the specific case of the Indus Valley civilization, because it is one of the most striking examples of a sophisticated civilization appearing in the archaeological record with relatively little visible precursor period. The Indus Valley civilization, centered on the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in what is now Pakistan, appears around 3300 BC as a mature, sophisticated urban culture with standardized weights and measures, a still undeciphered writing system, sophisticated sanitation and urban planning, and a level of organization that implies centuries of prior development. But that prior development is not well represented in the local archaeological record. The civilization appears in the archaeology somewhat faster than local development would predict. The genetic evidence from ancient Indus Valley populations shows significant ancestry from a group that has been called.
The survivors carried stories. This may sound obvious given everything we have been discussing tonight, but it is worth saying explicitly, because the stories were not a luxury or an afterthought. In the pre-literate world, the stories were the database. The stories contained the accumulated knowledge of the community in a form that could be transmitted, verified, corrected, and preserved without any technology beyond the human voice and the human memory. Agricultural knowledge was stored in planting myths. Astronomical knowledge was stored in star myths. Navigational knowledge was stored in voyage myths. Medical knowledge was stored in healing deity traditions. The flood story specifically stored the knowledge of the most catastrophic event in living memory and the instructions for surviving it if it happened again. The community that preserved the story accurately was the community that would know what did the inland populations make of the flood refugees when they arrived? This is a question the archaeological record cannot directly answer, but comparative anthropology and the mythological traditions themselves offer some clues. In many traditions, the culture hero who arrives from the sea bearing the gifts of civilization is treated with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. The Mesopotamian Apkallu are half fish. They come from the water. They are not entirely human. They are powerful and strange. Quetzalcoatl in the Mesoamerican tradition is a foreign figure, arriving from across the sea, who brings civilization but eventually departs, promising to return. The pattern of the culture hero who comes from the water and teaches the art. The knowledge transfer would not have been instantaneous or smooth. Two communities with different languages, different customs, different subsistence strategies, coming together under the pressure of catastrophic displacement. This is a recipe for conflict as much as for collaboration. The archaeological record of the post-Ice Age period shows evidence of both, sites where different cultural traditions appear to have merged peacefully, and sites where there is evidence of violence and displacement. The flood survivors were not welcomed everywhere they went. Some of them were absorbed into existing communities. Some of them established new communities in territory that was genuinely uninhabited. Some of them, in all likelihood, were killed or enslaved by the people whose lands they arrived in.
Language is one of the most interesting threads in this story, because the distribution of the world's language families does not map neatly onto the distribution of post-Ice Age populations in ways that are fully explained by the conventional archaeological narrative. There are linguistic connections between geographically separated peoples that are difficult to explain without positing either very early contact or a common ancestor population that has since dispersed. The relationship between Dravidian languages of South India and certain languages of Central Asia is one example. The proposed connection between certain Native American languages and ancient Asian languages is another. The distribution of the Austronesian.
The knowledge of deep water navigation is particularly significant in this context. For most of human history, it was assumed by Western scholars that ancient peoples were incapable of intentional deep water ocean navigation, that the settlement of the Pacific Islands, for example, was accidental, the result of being blown off course rather than deliberate voyaging. This assumption has been comprehensively dismantled by a combination of archaeological evidence, experimental archaeology, and the testimony of Pacific Island navigational traditions themselves, which describe sophisticated methods of ocean navigation using stars, waves, currents, bird behavior, and other natural signs that are far too systematic and precise to be accidental. Pacific Island navigators were among them. The boat. Every flood story has a boat, or something functionally equivalent to a boat, a vessel, a container, a floating platform that separates the survivors from the lethal water. In the context of what we now understand about post-Ice Age coastal cultures, this is not a surprising detail. Communities that lived on coastlines and river mouths were by necessity maritime communities. They had boats. They used them daily. For fishing, for transportation, for trade. When the water rose and the land disappeared, the people who survived were the people who had boats, or who could build them quickly enough, and who knew how to use them. The boat in the flood story is not a miraculous divine gift. It is the most logical survival tool available to a coastal maritime community facing inundation. Some researchers have proposed that the flood survivors were not just ordinary community members who happened to escape. They were, in some cases, the specific people responsible for maintaining and transmitting the community's most important knowledge: the priests, the astronomers, the agricultural specialists, the navigators, the storytellers. The people, in other words, who carried the community's accumulated expertise. In many traditions, the flood survivor is specifically described as righteous, wise, or specially selected, not just lucky, but the right person. In the practical terms of knowledge transmission, this might mean the person who survived was the person whose survival was most important to the community's continuity, because they carried the most irreplaceable knowledge. Whether this was divine selection or practical triage, the community deliberately ensuring that its most knowledge-rich members had the best chance of survival. The rainbow after the flood. In the Genesis account, God places a rainbow in the sky after the flood as a sign of the covenant never to destroy the world by water again. In other traditions, the period after the flood is marked by specific atmospheric or astronomical signs, unusual colors in the sky, the reappearance of particular stars, the return of specific birds. These post-flood signs are usually interpreted theologically. The gods are signaling their intentions. The universe is communicating its new order. But there is a possible physical interpretation that is interesting in the context of the volcanic and atmospheric disruptions associated with the post-Ice Age period. Major flood events, particularly those associated with glacial lake drainages and ice sheet collapses, were sometimes accompanied or followed by the olive branch. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test for dry land. Noah sends a dove that returns with an olive branch. The olive branch as a symbol of the return of habitable land is specific enough to be geographically meaningful. Olive trees grow in the Mediterranean region. The bird returning with an olive branch is a memory of a Mediterranean survivor looking for the reappearance of the specific vegetation of their specific region. This kind of geographical specificity in the details of the flood traditions is exactly what you would expect if the traditions are memories of real, regionally specific events, rather than generic mythology. The Mediterranean flood survivors remembered the olive. The Pacific Island survivors remembered the coconut palm. The Mesopotamian survivors remembered the specific birds of the river delta. Each tradition preserved the details of its own specific geography, the plants and animals that told the survivors the world they knew was coming back. The details are What did the survivors lose that they could not replace? This is perhaps the most melancholy question tonight's story asks. The practical knowledge, the agricultural and astronomical and navigational expertise was carried and transmitted and eventually rebuilt into the civilizations of the historical record. But other things were lost permanently. Languages went extinct when the last of their speakers died in the flood or in the displacement that followed. Artistic traditions, the songs, the dances, the visual art of the drowned coastal cultures are gone without a trace. The names of the places that are now underwater, the names people gave to the rivers and bays and mountains of the drowned world, are gone. The genealogies, the histories, the records of what happened in those communities before the water came, gone. What we have are the bare bones. The survivors walked inland. They settled in the river valleys and the highlands and the forests that had been at the margins of their world. They planted their seeds and managed their animals and built their shelters and told their children the story of the world that was lost. And slowly, over generations, what they knew became the foundation of new civilizations. The Sumerian cities, the Indus Valley towns, the Egyptian settlements along the Nile, the agricultural villages of the Yellow River Basin, all of them building in the post-flood world something new, but building it with the tools and knowledge and stories of the world that went under. The flood didn't just end one world, it seeded the next one. The survivors were the bridge. What they carried in their hands and their heads and their stories became the first chapters of recorded history. We are, in a very real sense, the civilization that the flood survivors built. We are what they carried. The lamp is very low now. The survivors have done their work, have carried their seeds and their animals and their astronomical charts and their stories across the flooded landscape and up into the hills and into the waiting valleys where the next world was going to be built. The flood stories say the dove returned with the olive branch. The raven did not come back. The water went down, and the people came out of the vessel and stood on the wet earth of the new world and looked at it. The mountains still there, the rivers running, the sky enormous and clear, and began, just began, the way people always began after the worst thing. Not with a plan exactly, but with the seeds in one hand and the story in the other, and the sheer human stubbornness that says, we are still here, we are still here. Let the lamp go out now. Let the story rest. Let the survivors rest. They have earned it. The world they built is the one you are lying in tonight. Sleep well. We have traveled a long way tonight. We have followed the flood stories from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia, from the frozen cores of Greenland glaciers to the submerged river valleys of the Persian Gulf. We have met the survivors and walked inland with them,
watching them plant their seeds and tell their children the story of the world that the water took. And now we arrive at the question that all of this has been building toward. Not the geological question, not the archaeological question, but the human one. What are these stories actually trying to say? Not what events they might be remembering, not what physical evidence supports or complicates them, but what the people who told them and who kept telling them across 10,000 years understood them to mean. Because the stories were not told as geology, they were told as wisdom.
Let's start with the most obvious layer of meaning, the one that every tradition makes explicit. The flood is a consequence. Something went wrong in the world before the water. The people became too corrupt, too noisy, too violent, too forgetful of the gods. The wooden people of the Mayan tradition mistreated the animals and forgot to honor the sacred. The humans of the Mesopotamian tradition disturbed the sleep of the gods with their endless noise. The generation of Noah had filled the world with violence. The pattern across traditions is not that the flood was random or arbitrary, it was caused. The world before the water had failed in some fundamental way, and the flood was the consequence of that failure. This is not a comfortable story. It is the oldest form of a story that human beings keep telling in every age, the story of a civilization that exceeded its limits and paid the price. The question of whether the pre-flood world had actually done something wrong, whether there is a moral dimension to the physical catastrophe of the post-Ice Age flooding, is obviously a theological and philosophical one that science cannot answer. But there is an interesting possibility embedded in the way the traditions frame the cause of the flood that is worth sitting with. Several traditions describe the pre-flood world not in terms of moral failure in any simple ethical sense, but in terms of a specific kind of disconnection from the natural world, from the sacred, from the limits that had previously been respected. The wooden people forgot to honor the animals they depended on. The humans became too loud, too busy, too numerous, too insistently present. The violence of Noah's generation was a violence against the fabric of the created order. There is a reading of the flood stories that treats them as encoded warnings, not about supernatural divine punishment, but about the physical consequences of specific kinds of human behavior in specific environmental conditions. The post-Ice Age world was one in which the climate was changing rapidly, sea levels were rising, and the margin between successful adaptation and catastrophic failure was thin. The communities that survived were the ones that maintained the social cohesion, the environmental knowledge, and the adaptive flexibility to respond to rapidly changing conditions. The communities that failed were the ones that had, in various ways, exceeded the carrying capacity of their environment, depleted their resources, or lost the social and knowledge infrastructure necessary for rapid adaptation. The ark as a container of diversity is a detail that appears in various forms across many of the flood traditions, and it carries a meaning that goes beyond the practical logistics of survival. The instruction to bring 2 of every kind, or in some traditions 7 of every kind, is not just about animal husbandry. It is about the preservation of difference. The ark is, in the deep logic of the tradition, a vessel designed to preserve the maximum possible variety of life through the bottleneck of catastrophe. The biological insight embedded in this detail is extraordinary. A population that passes through a cataclysmic bottleneck with too little genetic diversity does not survive long term. The figure of the flood survivor as the ancestor of all subsequent humanity appears consistently across traditions. Manu is the progenitor of the human race. Noah is the ancestor of all post-flood peoples. Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth from stones. The flood is not just a local disaster from which a few people escaped. It is a civilizational bottleneck, a point at which the human population was reduced to a remnant and from which all subsequent human history descends. This is mythological language for something that population genetics has found physical evidence of. Human populations have gone through bottlenecks.
The covenant after the flood. In many traditions, the period following the flood is marked not just by survival and rebuilding, but by a new agreement between the surviving humans and the divine, or between the human community and the natural world, that establishes the terms on which the new world will operate. In Genesis, God makes a covenant with Noah and all living things. The seasons will continue, seed time and harvest will not cease, and the rainbow is the sign of the promise. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the gods resolved their disagreement about the destruction of humanity and agreed to different methods of population control going forward. The covenant after the flood is the establishment of a new order, new rules, new relationships.
What did the survivors actually learn? In practical terms, setting aside the theological framework, the communities that came through the post-Ice Age catastrophes and rebuilt successfully appear to have learned several specific lessons that are visible in the archaeological and anthropological record of the early post-flood civilizations. They learned to live on higher ground. The earliest agricultural settlements are consistently on elevated terrain or well above the floodplains that would have been affected by coastal inundation. They learned to maintain surplus. The storage of food against scarcity is a feature of virtually every early agricultural civilization, and it represents a fundamental shift from the hand-to-mouth subsistence of many pre-agricultural communities. They learned to maintain social cohesion across larger groups. The scale of cooperation required to build the irrigation systems and granaries and
There is a specific kind of knowledge that the flood story preserves that is worth naming directly. The knowledge that the world can end. Not metaphorically, not theologically, but physically. That the material conditions that support human civilization can change catastrophically and with relatively little warning, and that the response to that possibility is not denial, but preparation. Every pre-modern culture that carried the flood story understood at some level that the world as they knew it was not permanent, that the coastlines could change, that the climate could shift, that the sea could rise. The birds sent out from the ark. It is such a small detail. A bird, a test, a patient waiting for the return or the non-return that will tell the survivor whether the world is ready. But it contains a sophisticated ecological understanding that the return of specific species to specific habitats is the most reliable indicator of whether those habitats have recovered enough to support life. The dove that returns without a branch tells you the world is not yet ready. The dove that returns with the olive branch tells you the Mediterranean coastal ecosystems are recovering. The raven that does not return tells you there is already enough carrion, enough dry land and dead things for a scavenging bird to sustain itself. These are not random birds. They are ecological indicators.
The mountain. We keep returning to the mountain because the mountain is in every tradition and the mountain means the same thing in every tradition. Safety, survival, the last solid ground above the water. But the mountain has another meaning in the flood traditions that is worth pausing on. The mountain as the place where knowledge is preserved. In many traditions, it is on the mountain after the flood that the covenant is made, the offering is given, the communication with the divine is renewed. The mountain is not just survival geography. It is the place where the connection between the human and the sacred, or in more secular terms, between the human community and the larger order of things, is reached. The number 7 appears with remarkable frequency in the flood traditions. 7 days of rain, 7 days of waiting, 7 pairs of clean animals, 7 antediluvian sages. In Mesopotamian cosmology, 7 was the number of completion and totality. In many ancient traditions, 7 was the number associated with the visible planets, the days of the week, the musical scale,
the fundamental organizing units of natural order. The appearance of seven in the flood traditions may be the preservation of an ancient cosmological framework in which the world was understood as structured around specific numerical relationships. Whether this represents actual astronomical knowledge embedded in the story or simply the symbolic use of a culturally significant number, the consistency of its appearance across traditions is one of the many details that keeps researchers looking more carefully at what else might be encoded.
The question of whether the flood stories contain encoded astronomical information is one of the more controversial and fascinating areas of current research. Several researchers have proposed that specific details in the flood traditions, the duration of the flood, the timing of the landing on the mountain, the specific stars mentioned in connection with the flood narrative, correspond to real astronomical events or configurations that would have been visible at specific historical dates. The Mesopotamian tradition associates the flood with specific positions of the constellation that we now call Aquarius, the water-bearer, in the night sky. If the flood narrative was used as an astronomical mnemonic, a story device for preserving and transmitting observational data about the sky, then the astronomical details embedded in it might be.
Let's talk about what the flood stories are not. They are not simple morality tales, despite the tendency of later religious traditions to read them that way. The moral framework, the gods punish humanity for its wickedness, is a layer of interpretation applied to the stories by cultures that needed to make theological sense of catastrophic destruction. But underneath that interpretive layer, the stories are more complex and more ambivalent than a simple punishment narrative. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods who decide to destroy humanity are not uniformly righteous. They are petty, divided, and in some cases explicitly cruel. The god Enlil, who sends the flood, is not presented as a paragon of justice. He is presented as
The compassionate deity who warns the survivor appears in tradition after tradition. Ea warns Utnapishtim, Prometheus warns Deucalion, Vishnu warns Manu. The fish that is Vishnu in disguise warns Manu in advance, giving him time to prepare. In the Hawaiian tradition, the god Khan descends on a rainbow to correct Nu's mistaken offering. Always in the flood tradition, there is an inside agent, a divine figure who takes the side of the survivor against the larger force of destruction. This figure is interesting for what it implies about how the survivors understood their own survival. They did not see themselves as having survived by chance. They saw themselves as having been warned, as having had access to information that most people didn't have. The post-flood world in the traditions is always better than the pre-flood world in one specific way. It knows the flood is possible. The world before the water was a world that did not know, or had forgotten, that everything could be taken by the sea. The world after the water is a world that carries that knowledge permanently, encoded in the most important story it possesses. The flood did not just destroy the old world, it educated the new one. It taught humanity at an enormous and terrible cost that the conditions supporting civilization are fragile, that the sea can rise, that complacency is the precursor to catastrophe, and that the correct response to that knowledge is not paralysis, but preparation. The covenant after the flood is the commitment to remember, and the story is the mechanism of remembering. The world after the water is wiser than We are living in 2026 in a world that is once again watching the water rise. Not at the catastrophic rate of the post-ice age meltwater pulses. The current rate of sea level rise, driven by anthropogenic climate change, is measured in millimeters per year rather than feet per decade. But the direction is the same. The physics are the same. The ice is melting. The sea is expanding. The low-lying coastal areas of the world, where the majority of the human population still lives just as it did in the Ice Age, are beginning to experience what the survivors of the post-Ice Age floods experienced: the creeping advance of a sea that is not going to stop. The communities most vulnerable to this process are, in many cases, the same communities that carry the oldest and most detailed flood traditions.
The flood story is not just about the past. This is perhaps its most important and least comfortable dimension. Every culture that carried the flood story understood it not purely as history, but as warning, as the record of something that happened once and could, under the right conditions, happen again. The covenant in Genesis says the world will not be destroyed by water again. But even that promise, in its theological context, is conditional on the maintenance of the new order. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that preserve accurate memories of post-Ice Age coastal inundation are traditions from communities that have watched their coastlines change within living memory and know from thousands of years of transmitted knowledge that coastlines can change catastrophically. The flood story is humanity's oldest and most widely distributed warning system. And there is something profound about the fact that the oldest story in the human record is a story about an ending that was also a beginning. Every flood tradition describes the worst thing, the loss of everything, the drowning of the known world, the deaths of almost everyone, and then, without exception, describes what came after. The water receded. The vessel came to rest on the mountain. The door opened, and the survivors stepped out into the new world and began. The flood story is not ultimately a story about destruction. It is a story about persistence, about the stubborn.
The lamp is almost out. The stories have done their work tonight, have carried us from the clay tablets of Nineveh to the submerged coastlines of the Persian Gulf, to the high ground where the survivors stood, looking out over the post-flood world, and decided to begin again. The water is quiet now, has been quiet for 6,000 years, since the post-Ice Age rise finally slowed and the coastline settled. But the stories are not quiet. They are still being told tonight in 200 languages on 6 continents by grandmothers and elders and storytellers who understand, in the bone-deep way that only very old knowledge can be understood, that the story matters, that the water can come back, that the high ground is real, that someone must carry the seeds and the animals and the memory of what was lost, that someone must keep telling the story so that whoever comes after will know. You are the whoever who comes after. You have heard the story now. Let your breath go slow. Let the water rest. Let the old world sleep under the sea that covers it. You know where the high ground is. You know what to carry. And you know, because you heard it tonight.
We have arrived at the last chapter. We have followed the water from the clay tablets of Nineveh to the submerged coastlines of the Persian Gulf. We have walked with the survivors inland, watched them plant their seeds and tell their children the story of the water took. We have read the ice cores and the sonar maps and the genetic record. We have sat with 200 traditions from 6 continents, all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same thing in different languages. And now we arrive at the question that all of this has been circling, the question that nobody has fully answered, that the evidence points toward but does not definitively resolve, that the traditions preserve but do not explain. Tonight we are going to sit with the question directly, not the comfortable version of it, the full version, the one that keeps researchers awake, the one the stories have been. Here is the question in its simplest form. Did it happen? Was there a real, global, civilization-ending flood or series of floods that so thoroughly transformed the human world that every surviving culture encoded the memory of it in their most sacred and carefully preserved traditions?
Or are the 200 traditions a coincidence of human psychology, the independent generation in every culture of a catastrophic water narrative from the universal human experience of floods, storms, and the terrifying power of the sea? The question sounds simple. The answer is not, because the evidence does not point cleanly in either direction. It points in both directions simultaneously, in ways that are genuinely difficult to reconcile. And the honest answer, the answer that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not yet know. We are close.
The case for a real shared event is compelling. The physical evidence for catastrophic post-Ice Age flooding is unambiguous. The sea did rise 400 feet. The continental shelves were drowned. The Black Sea was catastrophically inundated. Glacial lakes drained in sudden, devastating pulses. Tsunamis swept coastlines, and the entire process was punctuated by abrupt climate disruptions of extraordinary severity. Human populations were living on the coastlines that were affected. The timing of these events, roughly 15,000 to 6,000 years ago, corresponds to the period that the flood traditions appear to be pointing toward. The specific geographical details in many traditions.
The case for independent psychological generation is also compelling. Water is universally threatening. Every human culture lives near water and has experienced floods, storms, and the destructive power of rivers and seas. The narrative of cataclysmic destruction, followed by survival and rebuilding, is a fundamental human story structure, one that appears in traditions about fire, drought, disease, and war, as well as water. The specific details that seem so similar across traditions, the boat, the mountain, the birds, may be independently derived from the universal logic of flood survival rather than from a shared ancestral memory. And the academic tradition of comparative mythology has documented, repeatedly, the way similar story structures emerge independently in cultures with no contact.
But here is where it gets interesting, because the two cases are not mutually exclusive. The most sophisticated current thinking in this field does not ask whether the flood stories reflect real events or universal psychology. It asks how real events and universal psychology interact. How a real, catastrophic, physically documented series of events in the post-Ice Age world would have been processed, preserved, and transmitted by human minds that were already predisposed by the universal experience of water and catastrophe to encode it in exactly the narrative form we find it in. The flood happened. The human mind, encountering the flood, generated the flood story. The flood story was preserved because it encoded survival knowledge. The survival knowledge was transmitted because the communities that transmitted it survived.
The underwater archaeology question is the most practically significant unresolved issue in this entire discussion. We have established that the world's continental shelves contain the drowned remains of Ice Age coastal civilizations. We have established that the technology to survey and excavate these remains exists and is improving rapidly. We have established that the few sites that have been examined, the Black Sea floor, the Gulf of Combat, the North Sea Doggerland sites, have produced evidence consistent with pre-flood human habitation. And we have established that a systematic, globally coordinated survey of the world's continental shelves for evidence of Ice Age human civilization. There are people working on this. It is important to say that clearly. The researchers who have dedicated their careers to the underwater archaeology of the post-Ice Age world, the marine geologists, the oceanographers, the archaeologists who have adapted their methods to the deep water environment, are doing extraordinary work with limited resources. Robert Ballard's Black Sea expeditions, the work of Glenn Milne and others on mapping the drowned coastlines of the Ice Age world, Patrick Nunn's rigorous analysis of Pacific Island traditions, the ongoing surveys of the North Sea for evidence of Doggerland civilization, the scholars of indigenous oral traditions who are working to record and analyze traditions before they are lost. These are the people who are closest to the answer. They are working at the edges of what is currently possible, with the tools currently available.
What would it mean for history, for our understanding of human civilization,
for the way we tell the story of who we are and where we came from. If the flood traditions turned out to be accurate memories of a real, global, civilization-disrupting event, it would mean that the history of human civilization is older and more complex than the conventional narrative allows. It would mean that sophisticated human communities existed on the drowned coastlines of the Ice Age world, carrying knowledge and cultural traditions that were largely lost in the inundation. It would mean that the transition from the Ice Age world to the historical world was not a smooth progression. What would it mean for the flood traditions themselves, for the religious and cultural communities that have carried them for thousands of years, if the physical basis of the stories were confirmed? This is a complicated question, with different answers in different contexts. For some religious communities, the confirmation of a real flood event would be understood as validation of their sacred tradition. For others, the translation of a theological narrative into a physical one would feel like a reduction, a loss of the story's transcendent meaning in exchange for a merely geological one. For the indigenous communities whose oral traditions have been shown to preserve accurate geographical memories of post-Ice Age inundation, the scientific confirmation of what their traditions have always said is a matter of both cultural vindication and practical urgency. Because those same communities are watching the sea rise again, and their traditions, which accurately remember the last time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that global sea levels will rise between 0.3 and 1 meter by 2100 under current trajectories, with higher-end scenarios projecting significantly more. The Pacific Island nations, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, are already experiencing existential threats from rising seas and storm surges. The coastal populations of Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the Netherlands are already investing in adaptive infrastructure to manage the rising water. The mega-cities of the world built on river deltas and coastlines, Shanghai, Mumbai, Miami, New Orleans, Jakarta, are already beginning to grapple with the long-term implications of seas that are rising and will continue to rise. The flood story is not ancient history for these communities. There is a specific teaching embedded in the flood story that modern civilization is particularly poorly equipped to receive, and it is this: the world you are living in is not permanent. The coastlines you know, the climate you have grown up in, the sea level that has been stable for 6,000 years, these are not eternal features of a fixed world. They are a temporary configuration of a dynamic planet, and they can change. The Ice Age world, the world of the people who first told the flood story, was, in its own time, just as permanent feeling to its inhabitants as our world feels to us today. The coastlines of 20,000 BC. The question of what the flood survivors knew, the question of whether they had advanced knowledge of the catastrophe, whether they had developed a wisdom tradition sophisticated enough to understand what was happening to their world and why, is one that the traditions preserve in mythological form, but that may have a more prosaic physical answer. Communities that lived on coastlines for thousands of years developed intimate knowledge of sea level change, storm patterns, coastal erosion, and the behavior of the ocean at different seasons and in different years. Over generations, the accumulation of this observational knowledge would have included the observation that the sea was rising, slowly, unevenly, but consistently, and that the rate of rise was at certain periods accelerating. The people who paid attention to this, who maintained the tradition of careful coastal observation across generations, would have known. The dove and the olive branch. We keep coming back to this detail because it is the detail that contains the most hope. After everything, after the rain and the rising water and the loss of the known world, and the long, patient, terrifying wait in the vessel for the water to recede, a small bird comes back with a green branch in its mouth. Life is returning. The ecosystem is recovering. The olive tree, which needs soil and sun and time to survive, is growing again on the slopes of the post-flood landscape. The world is not dead. The world is coming back. The survivor who sees the olive branch knows for the first time since the water came that the worst is over, that the new world.
What does beginning again look like? In the traditions, it is always both practical and sacred. The survivor makes an offering to the god or the sky or the earth or the principle that allowed the survival. This is not merely religious ritual. It is the acknowledgement of something important, that the survivor did not survive alone, that the survival was enabled by forces larger than the individual, the warning that came, the knowledge that was preserved, the communities that maintained the tradition, the sheer contingency of being in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge. The offering after the flood is the survivor's recognition of dependence. And dependence, in the traditions,
The rainbow, when it comes, is the sign that the new agreement is in place. Whatever the physics of rainbows, the refraction of sunlight through water droplets in the post-storm atmosphere, what the survivor sees when they see the rainbow is permission. Permission to go back to the world. Permission to plant and build and raise children and establish the communities that will eventually become the cities and the civilizations of the historical record. The rainbow is the world giving the survivor permission to exist in it again. And the survivor, who has just come through the worst thing, who has just lost everything they knew and carried the remnant of what survived and waited in the vessel for the water to go down, the survivor looks at the rainbow and begins. Not happily necessarily, not without grief for everything that was lost, but with the specific 200 and more traditions, 6 continents, 10,000 years of telling. We have been in the company of this story all night, following it around the world, sitting with its details and its implications and its unanswered questions. And we arrive here, at the end, with the same story we started with, the oldest story in the human record, but perhaps understanding it differently than we did at the beginning. Not as a simple religious narrative about divine punishment and miraculous survival, not as pure mythology generated by the universal human fear of water, but as something more complex and more interesting than either of those readings allows, as the record of a real catastrophe, preserved across 10,000 years of telling, carrying inside its mythological container a set of practical, physical. The story survived. That is the final thing to say about it, and it is not a small thing. The story survived the drowning of the world that first told it. It survived the transition from oral to written transmission. It survived the rise and fall of the civilizations that recorded it. It survived colonial suppression, religious transformation, the silencing of indigenous voices, the loss of languages, the interruption of oral chains that had been unbroken for hundreds of generations. It survived everything the world threw it, and it is still here, tonight, in this room, in this moment, being told again. The 200 traditions are all, in some sense, the same act of telling, the same refusal to let the story die, the same understanding pass. You have heard it now, the full version, as complete as we can make it with the evidence currently available. The clay tablets and the oral traditions, and the ice cores, and the sonar maps, and the genetic record, and the drowned coastlines, and the survivors walking inland with their seeds. The 200 versions that are all one version of the same memory. The question that remains, the question of what exactly happened, of how global the event was, of what civilizations were lost on the continental shelves, of whether the underwater archaeology will ever be done at the scale the question deserves. That question remains open. It will be answered, eventually, by the researchers and the technology and the will to look. But the story doesn't wait for the answer. The story has never waited. It has always. The lamp is very low now. The tablets are cool. The water is still. has been still for a long time. The long stillness of a sea that finished rising 6,000 years ago and has rested, more or less, since. Somewhere under that still water, the old world is there. The river channels and the beaches and the structures and the hearths and the bones of the people who lived there and did not survive. All of it preserved in the sediment and the darkness of the deep water. Patient, the way only the truly lost can be patient. Waiting in its way, for the technology and the will and the moment when someone will go down and look. And somewhere above that water, on every continent, in every living tradition, you know the story now, the oldest story, the one that has been waiting for you across 10,000 years of telling, through clay and papyrus and spoken word, and the stubborn, undefeated human refusal to let the most important thing be forgotten. The water came. Almost everyone died. Someone survived. Someone remembered. Someone kept the story. And the story, this story, the one you heard tonight, is what they kept. Take it with you. Know where the high ground is. Know what to carry. Know that the conditions that support the life you are living are real and fragile and worth paying attention to. Know that someone always survives. And know, because you have heard it now, from the oldest source available, that the most important thing you can do, in any age, in any world, when the water is rising, or the world is changing, or the thing you depend on is threatened, is exactly what the survivors have always done. Remember, carry the story.